Good morning. Today's reading, Moral Luck by Thomas Nagel, is one of my favorite texts of the entire semester. I still clearly remember the moment when I first encountered Nagel's essay as an undergraduate and how it literally rocked my world. I truly envy you for reading it for the first time. And I hope that by the end of today's lecture, you'll be as amazed as I was all those years ago at how much great philosophy Nagel was able to pack into only 13 pages. Thomas Nagel was born in Yugoslavia in 1937, but his family, who were Jewish, fled to the USA in 1939, where Nagel grew up. After studies at Cornell and Harvard, Nagel taught for a few years at Berkeley before coming here to Princeton, where he was on the faculty from 1966 to 1980. After that, he moved up the road to NYU, where he's taught ever since and is now an emeritus professor. Nagel is best known for his contributions to philosophy of mind. His essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is particularly famous, and to moral and political philosophy. Two of Nagel's most important books are The Possibility of Altruism, published in 1970, and The View from Nowhere, published in 1986. Today's reading is taken from his collection of essays Mortal Questions, which came out in 1979. Like Bernard Williams, whom we read last week, Nagel is a gifted prose stylist and has the sensibility of a general humanist. He is at once a philosopher's philosopher and at the same time someone who made philosophy accessible to wider audiences. He is as comfortable writing in the pages of the New York Review of Books as in the seminar room. If you have a friend or a relative who has a curiosity about philosophy, but who doesn't want to wade through pages and pages of technical jargon, I suggest you give them Nagel's essay collection, Mortal Questions. It is one of the most profound, and yet also one of the most readable books of philosophy that I know. So let us turn then to Nagel's text on moral luck. Nagel's essay begins with an intuitively compelling thought. Prior to reflection, it seems extremely plausible that two people ought not to be assessed in a morally different way if the only differences between them, or how they acted, are due to factors beyond their control. This pre-theoretic intuition can be captured by a principle. Let's call it the control principle. It states, the object of moral assessments must be factors under our control. Moral assessments, for example, regarding praise or blame, or rightness or wrongness, should be luck independent. Now, it is an immediate corollary of this control principle that our moral assessments of two agents ought not to differ if the only differences between them, or how they acted, are factors beyond their control. What reasons does Nagel offer for believing the control principle, or at least for taking it seriously? Well, for one thing, it simply strikes him as intuitively compelling, as something that prior to reflection seems almost self-evident. The control principle for Nagel is not an artificial constraint on moral assessment, but something that intuitively we're strongly drawn to. But what is more, the truth of the control principle would allow us to make sense of widely recognized excusing conditions. Suppose, for instance, that I injure you, but you later discovered that I did this because I suffered from an involuntary muscle spasm, which caused one of my limbs to move without my control. Or suppose that I was being coerced by a gunman who threatened to shoot me. Or suppose you find out that I didn't know you were there. I was simply ignorant of your presence. In all these cases, you're liable to regard this new information as providing an excuse. You don't blame me as you would have had my behavior been voluntary, uncoerced, and fully informed. I'm not the proper target of a negative moral assessment. But what all these excusing conditions seem to have in common is that I, the agent, was not fully in control of my action. Accepting the control principle in the background, therefore, allows us to make sense of these commonly accepted excusing conditions. Finally, proponents of the control principle, or something like it, can also point to support from some pretty prominent philosophical sources. Probably the most prominent of these is Immanuel Kant himself. Nagel begins his essay with a quotation from section 1 of the groundwork, which is of course familiar to all of you from our discussion last week. I quote, "The good will is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes, or because of its adequacy to achieve some proposed end. It is good only because of its willing, that is, it is good of itself." Now, what Kant is saying here is that even if the goodwill should entirely fail to accomplish its purpose, its value is entirely undiminished. It's the thought that matters, as we might say. So what then is the problem? If the control principle is intuitively compelling in its own right, if it explains commonly accepted excusing conditions, and thirdly, boasts the support of some of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, why not just accept it? Well, the problem is this. Nagel believes that if the control principle is consistently applied, it in fact threatens to erode most of the moral assessments we find it natural to make. Because, as he writes, quote, "Ultimately, nothing, or almost nothing, about what a person does seems to be under his control." The upshot is that what appears as an intuitively plausible constraint on moral assessment threatens to undermine most instances of moral assessment itself. So herein lies the central paradox, and indeed the drama of Nagel's paper. The fact of the matter is, Nagel says, our everyday moral assessments are shot through with luck. Luck is pervasive, even omnipresent, not just in our everyday lives, but in morality as well. There is, in other words, moral luck. Now, moral luck, as Nagel defines it on page 59, is present in any situation where, quote, "a significant aspect of what someone does depends on factors beyond his control, yet we continue to treat him in that respect as an object of moral judgment," end quote. Nagel argues that moral luck in this sense is ubiquitous in our everyday moral thought. Let's consider some initial illustrations. Lara and Ursula are two drunk drivers who go on the road, equally intoxicated, with the same blithe indifference to the safety of other motorists and passers-by, and exposing others to equal levels of risk. However, Ursula is unlucky and runs over a child, whereas lucky Lara gets away with it and returns home without incident. Now, by assumption, Ursula and Lara's actions had the same profile of possible outcomes, with identical likelihoods attached to each outcome. Let's suppose they each had a 98% chance of getting home without incident and a 2% chance of causing a fatal accident. The crucial difference, of course, is where in this space of possibilities Lara and Ursula actually end up. Unlucky Ursula runs over and kills a child, whereas through sheer good luck, Lara gets away with it. Intuitively, Nagel thinks, this matters to how we should assess Lara and Ursula. Ursula is more blameworthy than Lara, Nagel thinks, because she actually killed a person. True enough, he says, Ursula's drunk driving could have turned out just as benignly as Lara's, but fatefully it didn't. That makes all the difference. Let's consider a second example. Ludwig and Ulrich are two twin brothers, extremely alike in personality and dispositions, growing up in the Germany of the Weimar Republic. However, in 1932, lucky Ludwig emigrates to Argentina in order to take up a business opportunity there. Ulrich, however, remains in Germany and is soon swept up in the rise of fascism. When World War II begins, Ulrich is drafted into the Wehrmacht. He's sent to Russia to fight as part of Operation Barbarossa, and there he is involved in committing barbaric atrocities against innocent Russian civilians. What are our thoughts on the two brothers? Well, we may firmly believe that had Ulrich, like his brother Ludwig, emigrated to Argentina at the beginning of the 1930s, he would have led a quiet and unremarkable life, never doing serious harm to anyone. It was sheer luck that it was Ludwig who ended up in Argentina, whereas Ulrich stayed back in Germany. And so, in a sense, it was sheer bad luck that Ulrich found himself in circumstances where he committed atrocities. And yet, doesn't this difference between the brothers clearly matter morally? The fact is, lucky Ludwig lived his entire life as an upstanding citizen who never harmed a fly. Ulrich, by contrast, committed war crimes. Surely, if anything matters morally, this difference matters to how we ought to assess Ludwig and Ulrich. So I think that these two initial illustrations make a pretty compelling case that many of our ordinary moral judgments are tacitly committed to the idea that there is such a thing as moral luck. But now you may be thinking, well then, if moral luck is ubiquitous in our ordinary ethical thought, as you say, why not take the other way out and simply reject the control principle? Perhaps this was one of these ideas that seem plausible at first blush, but once you examine it more closely and examine its implications, it turns out to be clearly false. Well, Nagel considers this response, but he considers it too simple. He thinks this simple solution is not available to us. As he writes on page 59, why not conclude then that the condition of control is false, that it is an initially plausible hypothesis refuted by clear counterexamples? What rules out this escape is that we are dealing not with a theoretical conjecture, but with a philosophical problem. The condition of control does not suggest itself merely as a generalization from certain clear cases. It seems correct in the further cases to which it is extended beyond the original set. The erosion of moral judgment emerges not as the absurd consequence of an oversimple theory, but as a natural consequence of the ordinary idea of moral assessment when it is applied in view of a more complete and precise account of the facts. It would therefore be a mistake to argue from the unacceptability of the conclusions to the need for a different account of the conditions of moral responsibility. The view that moral luck is paradoxical is not a mistake, ethical or logical, but a perception of one of the ways in which the intuitively acceptable conditions of moral judgment threaten to undermine it all." End quote. So that, in a nutshell, is the central paradox at the heart of Nagel's essay. Having introduced the problem of moral luck, Nagel then goes on to distinguish various ways in which moral luck can manifest itself. Specifically, in his paper, Nagel distinguishes 4 types of moral luck. Why don't you pause your video, get out your copy of Nagel's text, and see if you can identify and briefly define the 4 types of moral luck that Nagel describes. I'll wait for you. All right, welcome back. In his essay, Nagel distinguishes between the following 4 types of moral luck. First, outcome luck, that is, luck in the way one's actions or projects turned out. Second, circumstantial luck, that is, luck involved in the kinds of problems and situations one faces. Third, constitutive luck, that is, the luck involved in one's having the inclinations, capacity, and temperament that one does. And finally, the most general category of all, causal luck. In other words, luck in how one and what one does is determined by antecedent circumstances. We'll now go through these different types of moral luck one by one, starting with outcome luck. The claim that there is outcome luck is the claim that how your action turns out can affect our moral assessment of it, for instance, with regard to blameworthiness. We saw this in the case of the two drunk drivers. Intuitively, unlucky Ursula, who runs over a child, seems more blameworthy than lucky Lara, who gets away with it. While both women are to blame for putting innocent pedestrians at risk, Ursula, but not Lara, is also to blame for killing a child. How an agent's action turns out may also matter intuitively to how much punishment seems appropriate. Imagine a pair of assassins, each tasked with killing an innocent politician. The first assassin succeeds. His bullet hits the politician in the heart, killing him on the spot. The second assassin, just as determined and skillful, fails because, unbeknownst to him, the politician happened to be wearing a bulletproof vest, and as a result sustains only a few bruised ribs. Now, the law certainly draws a sharp distinction in penalties between these cases. One is murder, the other merely attempted murder, and the penalties for these often vary considerably. Or consider the problem, so common in public life, of having to make a difficult decision under conditions of uncertainty. It is tempting to feel, Nagel writes, that some decision must be possible in light of what is known at the time, which will make reproach unsuitable, no matter how things turn out. But this is not so, Nagel continues. Quote, when someone acts in such ways, he takes his life and his moral position into his own hands, because how things turn out determines what he has done. Let's make this more concrete. Consider the example of the American Revolution, which Nagel discusses on page 62. So he writes, if the American Revolution had been a bloody failure resulting in greater repression, then Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington would still have made a noble attempt and might not even have regretted it on their way to the scaffold. But they would also have had to blame themselves for what they had helped to bring on their compatriots. End quote. Now, moral outcome luck, as Nagel defines it, should be carefully distinguished from a related but importantly different phenomenon, what the philosopher Bernard Williams, in his own paper on moral luck, calls agent regret. Let me illustrate this with an example. So, consider a truck driver carefully and alertly driving his vehicle down the street. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a young child darts in front of his truck. The driver slams on the brakes, but there's just not enough time. Bam! The truck collides with the young child. The child is killed. Now, this driver, Nagel thinks, will understandably feel awful about his role in the child's death. He was the cause of the child's death. And intuitively, it would be deeply disturbing if he didn't. An agent regret is the special form of sadness or pain accompanying the wish that things had been otherwise with regard to something with which one's agency was somehow causally involved. But while this truck driver has clearly been unlucky, this is not, Nagel thinks, bad moral luck, properly speaking. The appropriate response here is not guilt or self-blame, but a kind of sadness or regret. As Nagel puts it on page 61, the driver, if he's entirely without fault, will feel terrible about his role in the event, but will not have to reproach himself. Therefore, this example of agent regret is not yet a case of moral bad luck. All right, before we move on, let us look at some possible philosophical responses to the problem of moral outcome luck. Because Immanuel Kant is by no means the only philosopher to be deeply uneasy with the thought that the moral worth of our actions could be hostage to fortune. Many people, philosophers and layfolk alike, chafe at the thought that two agents who behaved in exactly the same way in all respects that were under their control could nonetheless differ widely in their degree of blameworthiness. So I think it behooves us to discuss some possible strategies for denying the phenomenon of moral outcome luck. Now, the first option might be to simply reject outcome luck and revise our practices of moral assessment. Moral appraisal, according to this proposal, should only be directed at the agent's intentions or volitions, not the outcomes of her actions. The Scottish Enlightenment philosopher and economist Adam Smith contemplated such a move in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith writes, "To the intention or affection of the heart, therefore, to the propriety and impropriety, to the beneficence or hurtfulness of the design, all praise or blame, all approbation or disapprobation of any kind which can justly be bestowed upon any action, must ultimately belong." Now, the problem with this approach, as Adam Smith himself already noted, is that it is simply very hard to sustain outside of the philosophy classroom. The passage I just quoted continues as follows. "But how well soever we may seem to be persuaded of the truth of this equitable maxim, when we consider it after this manner in abstract, yet when we come to particular cases, the actual consequences which happen to proceed from any action have a very great effect upon our sentiments concerning its merit or demerit, and almost always either enhance or diminish our sense of both. Scarce in any one instance, perhaps, will our sentiments be found, after examination, to be entirely regulated by this rule, which we all acknowledge ought entirely to regulate them." End quote. A second possible strategy for dealing with the problem of moral outcome luck consists not in revising our ordinary practices of blame and of punishment, but rather in trying to find an explanation and justification of these practices that doesn't rely on the irksome thought that there is genuine moral outcome luck. In other words, we're trying to explain away the appearance that there is genuine moral outcome luck by giving a different explanation of the moral phenomena. Such an argument might proceed roughly as follows. One factor relevant to blame or punishment are a person's intentions in action and other mental states, what criminal lawyers call the mens rea. However, we rarely know exactly what a person's intentions are, or the strength of her commitment to a course of action. Now, one admittedly fallible indicator is whether she succeeds or not. In particular, if someone succeeds, that is some evidence that the person was seriously committed to carrying out a fully formed plan. The same evidence is not usually available when the plan is not carried out. Thus, rather than indicating our commitment to cases of moral outcome luck, our differential treatment of successful and unsuccessful murderers indicates our different epistemic situations with respect to each. Now, here's a little thinking exercise for you, and I'm encouraging the preceptors to take this up with you in class next week. First, what do you make of these two strategies for trying to deal with the problem of moral outcome luck? Do you think that either of them succeeds? And secondly, if your answer to the first question is yes, ask yourself a second question. Can this type of response to the problem of moral outcome luck likewise work for the three other kinds of moral luck that Nagel identifies? All right, let us return to Nagel's text and talk about the second type of moral luck which he identifies, namely circumstantial luck. Circumstantial luck is, if anything, even more pervasive than outcome luck, since, as Nagel puts it, the things we are called upon to do, the moral tests we face, are importantly determined by factors beyond our control. Nagel's point here is that what we do is first of all the product of what situation we are in, but that is often not subject to our control. Suppose, for example, that a dangerous situation calls for a heroic act. A house is on fire, a baby is trapped inside. Some brave bystander, let's call her Helga, rises to the occasion. She rushes into the house at great personal risk and saves the baby. Helga is a hero. Now, suppose that another woman, Norma, would have acted in identical fashion had she been in Helga's position. But the fact is, it simply never happens that Norma finds herself in circumstances where, at great personal risk, she can perform a heroic rescue. Instead, Norma leads a quiet and unremarkable life. This is not at all Norma's fault, it's sheer happenstance. Nonetheless, many want to say, Norma is not a hero. You become a hero by acting like one. And the fact is, Norma simply hasn't had the opportunity to do anything heroic in her life. The case of lucky Ludwig and unlucky Ulrich is the tragic mirror image of this. Many of the citizens of Nazi Germany would probably have had perfectly ordinary, decent lives, free of major crimes and turpitude, if they had lived in more fortunate circumstances. By the same token, and this is the really uncomfortable thought, how certain can we be that if we had lived in the Third Reich, we would have not committed similar moral crimes? Sure, we might hope that we would have been among the very small proportion of the population that actively opposed itself to Hitler's murderous regime, with all the terrible costs that this often entailed. But how sure can we be that this isn't just comforting self-flattery? How sure can we be that we would have had the fortitude to stand up and be counted? Indeed, from the 1960s, social psychologists began to show in a series of impressive studies that how we act is often much less attributable to our character or personality, and much more often the product of features of the situation we're in. What social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error is the tendency for people to overemphasize dispositional or personality-based explanations for behaviors observed in others, while underemphasizing situational explanations. In other words, people have a cognitive bias to assume that a person's actions depend on what kind of person that person is, rather than on the social and environmental forces that influence the person. One of the most famous and horrifying studies in this research program was the set of experiments on obedience to authority carried out by the Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1961. Here's a brief video clip with footage of the actual experiments.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer.
He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Horrifying indeed. What Milgram found was that ordinary people are likely to follow orders, albeit reluctantly in many cases, if these orders are given to them by a perceived authority figure, a man in a white lab coat, even to the extent of gravely injuring or even killing an innocent human being, or at least so they thought. Indeed, a full 65% of the participants in Milgram's study continued to the highest level of 450 volts. All participants continued to 300 volts. Here's how Milgram sums up the conclusions of his study in his article, The Perils of Obedience. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study. End quote. So this and other sobering evidence from social psychology gives us ample reason to think that the circumstances in which we find ourselves powerfully shape our behavior. It is our great good fortune that we live in the comparatively benign environment of the early 21st century United States and not in Nazi Germany. And yet, and this is Nagel's key point, does recognizing that our actions are powerfully shaped by the circumstances mean that we don't rightly blame the actual Nazi criminals for the crimes they actually committed? By no means. Their actions were horrific and should absolutely affect how we morally assess these people, Nagel thinks. The uncomfortable thought that, had we found ourselves in similar circumstances, we might have acted similarly badly, may rightly cause us to say to ourselves, "There, but for the grace of God go I." But saying, "but for the grace of God," or "but for good luck for the secular amongst us," is precisely to acknowledge that it would have been a moral disaster for us, an indelible stain on our records as moral agents, had we behaved in the way that unlucky Ulrich did. It is precisely to acknowledge that it matters to our assessment as moral agents what we actually did, and not just what we might have done had the circumstances been different. Thus, the thesis that there is circumstantial moral luck is the thesis that how we should assess other agents is substantially a matter of how they actually acted, given the circumstances they actually found themselves in. Even though we know that, A, had they been in different circumstances, they would have behaved very differently, either better or worse, and B, it was merely a matter of luck that they found themselves in the actual circumstances. But perhaps you're skeptical of the claims of psychologists like Milgram. Perhaps you think to yourself, I would not have committed these crimes, I'm sure. I have the character, the inner fortitude to do the right thing, even under extreme adverse pressure. Suppose you think this. Does this mean that you've escaped the problem of moral luck? By no means. In fact, you've just run straight into the arms of the third form of moral luck that Nagel distinguishes, namely constitutive luck. Constitutive luck, quote, concerns the kind of person you are, where this is not a question of what you deliberately do, but of your inclinations, capacity, and temperament, end quote. For example, are you brave or cowardly, generous or envious, charming or dour, caring or cold and indifferent towards others? Nagel thinks that which of these fundamental personality traits we possess is largely beyond our control. And yet he simultaneously believes that these virtues and vices of our characters are appropriate objects of moral assessment. The thesis that there is constitutive luck, then, is the thesis that our moral assessment of you as a person should substantially depend on the kind of person you are, even if this is ultimately due to factors beyond your control. Now, this is not an uncontroversial thought. Immanuel Kant, for one, would not have shared it. Blaming people for what they are like, Kant thought, is irrational and unfair. What matters is the quality of their will in acting. And if, despite having these vices, a person succeeds in acting from the motive of duty, there is nothing to reproach. You'll recall how in Groundwork 1, Kant writes, "If nature had put little sympathy into the heart of this or that man, if, though in other respects an honest man, he is by temperament cold and indifferent to the sufferings of others, if nature had not properly fashioned such a man for a philanthropist, would he not still find with himself a source from which to give himself a far higher worth than what a mere good-natured temperament might have? By all means." Nagel, however, disagrees. We judge people for more than their actions, he thinks. Even if a person manages to overcome their character vices and act perfectly, we still, as a matter of fact, blame them for having this vice. As Nagel writes, "An envious person hates the greater success of others. He can be morally condemned as envious, even if he congratulates them cordially and does nothing to denigrate or spoil their success." End quote. Let us come, finally, to the fourth and most general form of moral luck in Nagel's typology. He notes that, taken to its logical conclusion, the control principle seems to imply that individuals can be morally assessed for hardly anything at all. Why is that? We are part of a world governed by natural laws, and a causal history that long predates our own existence. How we are and what we do in life is inseparable from these facts, as Nagel writes. Everything seems to result from the combined influence of factors, antecedent and posterior to action, that are not within the agent's control. Since he cannot be responsible for them, he cannot be responsible for their results. The area of genuine agency, and therefore of legitimate moral judgment, seems to shrink under this scrutiny to an extensionless point. So, viewed at this level of generality, Nagel is not optimistic that there is any solution to the problem of moral luck. What makes the problem of moral luck into an irresolvable paradox, he thinks, is that it in fact arises from a clash of two irreconcilable perspectives or viewpoints on our agency: the objective or external point of view and the subjective or internal or intersubjective point of view. Now, each of these perspectives, Nagel thinks, is extremely compelling in its own right and hard to give up, yet they seem irreconcilable. That is what makes the problem of moral luck a genuine paradox. On the one hand, we can take an external point of view on ourselves. What we see from this objective or external perspective is that we are part of a larger world governed by natural laws. We see that we are not responsible for our own existence or our nature or the choices we have to make or the circumstances that give our acts the consequences they have. From here, we see the gradual erosion of what we do by the subtraction of what happens. In the end, the responsible self itself seems to vanish. It's for that reason that Nagel elsewhere calls this external perspective the view from nowhere. As he writes on page 68, "I believe that, in a sense, the problem has no solution, because something in the idea of agency is incompatible with actions being events, or people being things. But as the external determinants of what someone has done are gradually exposed in their effect on consequences, character, and choice itself, it becomes gradually clear that actions are events and people things. Eventually, nothing remains which can be ascribed to the responsible self, and we are left with nothing but a portion of the larger sequence of events which can be deplored or celebrated, but not blamed or praised. However, plausible as it may be, a purely external point of view cannot be sustained for long, Nagel thinks. From the inside, we see a distinction between what we do and what happens to us. We feel a sense of control. And despite our awareness that we are ourselves part of a universe governed by laws of nature, we act under the idea of freedom. It is this point of view that is employed when we make moral judgments of ourselves and others. As Nagel writes on page 68, we are unable to view ourselves simply as portions of the world, and from inside we have a rough idea of the boundary between what is us and what is not, what we do and what happens to us, what is our personality and what is an accidental handicap. We extend to others the refusal to limit ourselves to external evaluation, and we accord to them selves like our own. Guilt and indignation, shame and contempt, pride and admiration are two sides of the same moral attitudes. So that's the deepest source of the paradox of moral luck. Our plight as human agents, who live in a world governed by causal laws outside of our control, but who act under the idea of freedom, is to live with this tension between the external and the internal perspectives on our behavior. I hope you now see why all those years ago I had my mind blown by reading Nagel's essay. Sometimes the best works of philosophy are not those that offer neat solutions, but that make the world a stranger place to us.